There is a particular kind of tragedy reserved for people who become famous before they understand what fame actually costs. Frankie Lymon lived that tragedy in full. He was a boy who sold millions of records before he could legally sign a contract, a teenager whose voice defined the sound of early rock and roll, and a young man who was found dead on a bathroom floor with almost nothing to his name. By the time he was buried, the industry that made its fortune off him could not be bothered to send flowers. This is the story of how that happened, and why it still matters. Franklin Joseph Lymon was born in the fall of in Harlem, New York, into a family that never had quite enough. His father drove a truck for a living and sang gospel music on the side, and his mother worked as a domestic cleaner in other people's homes. Music was constant in the household, not as a luxury but almost as a form of survival, something the family turned to because it was free and it was theirs. The Lymons were poor even by the standards of post-war Harlem. Frankie grew up sharing cramped rooms with siblings, watching his parents stretch every dollar before it even arrived. Like a lot of kids in his neighborhood, he started working long before other children his age were allowed to. He carried groceries for tips. He ran errands for whoever would pay him a few coins, and some of those errands, by his own later accounts and those of people who knew him, drifted into the gray and illegal edges of Harlem street life. It was not unusual for boys from his block. The city did not leave much room for innocence when a family needed to eat. What set Frankie apart from other hustling kids on those blocks was his voice. It was high, clear, and had an unusual power to cut through a room. He did not know yet that it would change his life completely. In the middle of a handful of teenagers from Frankie's neighborhood had started singing together on street corners and in apartment hallways, the way so many doo-wop groups of that era got their start. They rehearsed wherever they could find space, since none of their families had rooms large enough to hold a full vocal group comfortably. Frankie was not originally part of this group. He heard them by chance, liked what he heard, and talked his way into joining as a tenor. The turning point came when a passerby, himself a singer with some standing in the local music scene, stopped to listen to the boys harmonizing in a hallway. He was struck by how good they sounded despite having no formal training and no professional setting. He began mentoring them informally and eventually helped arrange an audition with a small independent record label being run by an ambitious executive hungry for the next big vocal group. According to the group's own later accounts, the song that would make them famous was inspired by a batch of old love letters that had been left behind after a breakup involving a tenant in the building where they rehearsed. A couple of the boys combed through the letters looking for a hook, and found a line about birds singing sweetly as though they were happy in love. That fragment became the seed of the song that would turn their lives upside down. When the group finally got its audition, the original lead singer either could not make it or could not perform that day, depending on which account you believe. Frankie stepped up, since he had helped shape the melody and knew the words as well as anyone. He sang, and everyone in the room understood immediately that something special had just happened. His voice was a true boy soprano, bright and clean, but with a texture that made it feel raw and modern rather than delicate. The label signed the group on the condition that Frankie remain the permanent lead voice. Not long after, the group's name changed to better target the exploding new market of teenage record buyers, a demographic the recording industry was only just beginning to understand it could sell directly to. The song went into the studio, came out in the opening weeks of, and detonated across the charts almost immediately. It became a massive hit in the United States and crossed the Atlantic to top the charts in Britain as well, selling millions of copies within its first year. A 13-year-old boy from a struggling Harlem family had, almost overnight, become one of the first black teen idols in American pop music, a genuine pioneer whose sound helped define what rock and roll would become. What the public did not see, and what history has only slowly pieced together, was how quickly the adults around Frankie began carving up the fortune his voice was generating. When the copyright paperwork for the song was filed, the two group members who had actually done much of the work finding and shaping the lyrics were left off entirely. Instead, songwriting credit went to the label's founder and to Frankie himself, a legal arrangement that allowed the executive to claim half the publishing royalties for a song he had not written. Frankie was a young teenager at the time and had no real understanding of what publishing rights even were, let alone the power to stop what was happening to his bandmates. The situation worsened when the label's founder, drowning in gambling debts, sold his interest in the company to a far more dangerous figure in the music business, a man with deep and well-known connections to organized crime. This new owner simply removed the previous credit and replaced it with his own name, taking control of the royalty stream for a song that would go on selling for decades. He had no hand in writing it. He simply had the power to take it, and in the music industry of that era, power very often mattered more than authorship. The other members of the group, still teenagers with no legal guidance and no money for lawyers, were eventually persuaded to sign away any future claim to royalties in exchange for a single flat payment, an amount that looks almost absurd set against the millions the song would go on to earn. They did not fully understand what they were signing. They simply needed money, and someone in a suit was offering it. Frankie's own situation was, in some ways, even more troubling. Because he was a minor, state law required that his earnings be placed into a court-supervised trust until he reached adulthood, a legal safeguard designed for exactly this kind of situation. That safeguard was never honored. His parents were told, in vague and reassuring terms, that his money was accumulating safely somewhere. No such account was ever properly established under court supervision. The wealth Frankie generated through record sales, touring, and songwriting credit simply vanished into the business dealings of the men managing him. He would spend the rest of his life without ever recovering it. Industry figures around Frankie soon recognized that he, personally, was the commercial engine driving the group's popularity. There was more money to be made positioning him as a solo act than as one voice among five. During overseas touring, Frankie was increasingly pushed to perform solo segments separate from the other boys, a decision that predictably created resentment and jealousy within the group. The bond that had once made them close friends and collaborators began to fracture. By the later part of, still only a teenager, Frankie left the group entirely. What followed was immediate and brutal. Stripped of the vocal backing that had given the original recordings their texture and warmth, his solo material sounded thin by comparison. Radio stations that had once played his hit constantly showed little interest in his new songs. None of them charted with any real success. Within a couple of years, the 15-year-old sensation had become, in industry terms, a has-been before he had even finished growing up. Compounding the collapse of his career was a second, entirely natural crisis that no manager could control: puberty. As Frankie's voice deepened into an adult register, the trademark boy soprano sound that had made him famous simply disappeared. Audiences who had loved him as a novelty act, a charming child prodigy, had little patience for a grown man's voice singing the same songs. Bookings dried up. Promoters stopped calling. The industry that had profited so heavily from his childhood voice discarded him the moment that voice changed. There was also a moment of real controversy that accelerated his decline. During a live television performance on a nationally broadcast musical variety program, Frankie was seen dancing on camera with a white teenage girl from the audience. In the deeply segregated media landscape of the late, this innocent moment triggered outrage among some Southern affiliate stations, and the backlash was severe enough that the show was permanently canceled. It was not scandal of Frankie's making. It was simply the racial climate of the era turning an ordinary teenage moment into a career-ending controversy. By the time he was 18, the boy who had earned millions for other people was broke, isolated, and without any of the structure or support a teenager going through this kind of collapse would need. The years following his fall from stardom were marked by two intertwined tragedies: a devastating drug addiction and a personal life defined by instability. Struggling with the loss of his career, his wealth, and the only identity he had ever known, Frankie was introduced to heroin while still a teenager himself. Reportedly through older musicians in the jazz and rhythm and blues circles he continued to move through. The addiction took hold quickly and never fully released its grip on him for the rest of his life. His romantic life during these years was equally turbulent. At the height of his teenage fame, he became involved with an older female vocalist from another popular group, a relationship that had to be kept quiet given the age gap and the risk it posed to both of their public images. Years later, as an adult, he married a woman he met while touring, and the two had a daughter together who tragically died just days after birth, a loss that devastated him on top of everything else he had already lost. Unknown to Frankie at the time, that marriage was legally invalid, because his wife's divorce from a previous husband had not yet been finalized when they wed. He lived believing he was legitimately married, when in fact the paperwork behind that belief was incomplete. He later reconnected with the older singer he had been involved with years earlier, and she would later claim, without documentation to prove it, that the two of them had eloped across the border and married in a private ceremony. No certificate or legal record of that marriage was ever located. Finally, while stationed at an army base in the South during a stint in the military, Frankie met a schoolteacher, an ordinary woman with a stable life far removed from the music industry. The two fell in love and were married in a proper, legally documented ceremony at a Baptist church. For the final period of his short life, this relationship gave him something close to a normal home, with a partner who wanted nothing from him beyond his love and companionship. To fund a worsening addiction, Frankie increasingly turned to petty crime throughout the early and mid, and he was arrested multiple times across several states on charges ranging from theft to drug possession. At one point, facing serious legal trouble, he was given a choice between prison and military enlistment. He chose the army, hoping the discipline of military life might help him get clean. It did not work out that way. Desperate for money to sustain his addiction, he repeatedly went absent without leave from his post so he could perform paid gigs at small clubs in the region. The military eventually ran out of patience and discharged him dishonorably. He left the service with no career, no money, and an addiction that had only deepened. Despite everything, record labels occasionally expressed interest in signing him for a comeback, hoping to recapture even a fraction of the magic that had made him a star as a teenager. Time and again, these opportunities collapsed because Frankie was too consumed by addiction to reliably show up for sessions or performances. Each failed opportunity made the next one harder to secure. In the early months of, his manager secured what would be his last real shot at a comeback, a recording session arranged with a label in New York. It was a genuine opportunity, one that could have marked a turning point if it had gone well. Frankie traveled from the South back to Harlem for the session and stayed with his grandmother in the same neighborhood where he had grown up and first discovered his voice. The pressure of the moment appears to have been too much. The night before the scheduled session, he used drugs while alone in his grandmother's bathroom. The dose proved fatal, causing a sudden cardiac arrest. When his grandmother found the bathroom door locked and got no response the next morning, she broke it open and found him dead on the floor. He was 25 years old. The contrast between the boy who had once filled arenas and sold millions of records and the man found dead in a modest Harlem apartment, with nothing of value in his pockets, is almost impossible to overstate. He had performed on some of the biggest stages in the world as a child. He died with essentially nothing to show for it, in the same neighborhood where his story had begun. What followed his death was, in its own way, as painful as the death itself. The record executives who had built fortunes off his childhood voice offered no financial support for his funeral arrangements. None of the companies that had once fought over his contract sent flowers or acknowledged his passing in any meaningful way. Former bandmates, many of whom still carried real resentment from the group's breakup years earlier, did not attend. The public, which had adored him as a young teenager a decade earlier, had largely forgotten him by the time he died. Because his estate had no money and no company stepped in to cover the cost, he was buried in an inexpensive casket, in a grave that went unmarked for years afterward. For roughly 2 decades, one of the most influential young voices in early rock and roll rested in an anonymous plot, essentially erased from public memory. It took a dedicated doo-wop fan organization, discovering the state of his grave in the mid, to finally raise the money needed for a proper headstone through a series of benefit concerts featuring artists from that era. Even then, the effort became entangled in the ongoing legal disputes over his estate, and the headstone the fans paid for ended up displaced, eventually finding a home decades later in a music heritage museum rather than at his actual gravesite. Frankie's death did not end the exploitation that had defined his career. In the early, a new cover version of his signature song by a major recording star returned it to the charts and generated a fresh wave of royalty income, money that suddenly made his estate worth fighting over. 3 women, each of whom had married him at different points without any of the marriages having been properly dissolved beforehand, all came forward claiming to be his legitimate widow and rightful heir. The resulting legal battle stretched on for years and moved through multiple courts. One marriage was ultimately ruled invalid because his wife's prior divorce had not been finalized at the time of their wedding. Another woman's claim was rejected for lack of any documentation proving the marriage had ever legally taken place. In the end, the schoolteacher he had married in a proper church ceremony during his time in the army was recognized as his sole lawful widow and was awarded control of his estate. Separately, the surviving members of his original vocal group pursued their own long-overdue justice, eventually winning a lawsuit that restored their songwriting credit on the very song that had launched all of their careers and awarded them a substantial sum in back royalties. That victory, however, did not last. An appeals court later overturned the decision on a technicality related to how long they had waited to bring their claim, stripping their names from the credits once again and returning the songwriting rights to the estate of the very man who had taken them illegitimately in the first place. It is tempting to read Frankie Lymon's life as simply a cautionary tale about drug addiction, but that framing lets too many people off the hook. Long before addiction entered the picture, Adults who were supposed to protect a working-class black child from Harlem instead saw him as a resource to be extracted. His songwriting credit was stolen before he was old enough to vote. His trust fund, legally mandated to protect his earnings, was never honored. His own bandmates were paid a fraction of what they were owed and pressured into signing away the rest. The industry that built itself on his talent discarded him the moment his voice changed and never looked back. His personal chaos, the undissolved marriages, the years of addiction, the military discharge, none of it happened in a vacuum. It happened to a boy who had been financially and emotionally abandoned by the very people entrusted with his well-being at the exact moment he needed structure and guidance the most. He was 13 years old when he became one of the most famous teenagers in America, and he was 25 when he died with nothing, in the same neighborhood where his story had started, having never once seen the fortune his voice had generated for other people. Frankie Lymon helped invent a sound that would echo through decades of American music, influencing generations of performers who came after him, some of whom would go on to become the biggest stars in the world. His voice is still instantly recognizable today, still capable of stopping a room, still played on oldie stations and streaming platforms by people who have no idea what happened to the boy behind it. That gap, between the joy his music still brings people and the almost total indifference shown to him in life and in death, remains one of the most quietly devastating stories in the history of American popular music. He deserved better than what he got, both from the industry that used him and from the country that briefly loved him before moving on. Remembering his story honestly, rather than as a simple tragedy of personal failing, is the least that can be done for a boy who gave the world one of its most beloved songs and received almost nothing in return.